Story 1, Miguel Bencero, the woman who wanted to come home, Guadalajara, Mexico. That night, the sky was covered with thick clouds that hid the stars, and a fine drizzle made the road glow under the light of the headlights of my old Freightliner Cascadia. I'd been driving down Route 66 for hours, trying to stay awake with a cup of bitter coffee and the radio spitting static between country songs. It was then that I saw a solitary figure on the side of the road, under the yellowish light of a lamppost. As I approached, I could make out that it was a woman, probably in her 30s, with soaked dark hair and a white dress that looked out of place on that cold, damp night. His hand was raised in distress. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about his desperate countenance made me stop. I rolled down the window and motioned for him to come up. "Thank you for stopping," he said, his voice soft and trembling from the cold. I offered her a blanket that I always carried in the cockpit, and she settled into the passenger seat, grateful. His eyes, deep green, looked at me with a mixture of relief and something else I couldn't identify. "My name is Carla," he said, rubbing his hands together to warm himself up. "I'm Miguel," I answered as I started the truck again. "Where are you going?" "I just want to get home," he said, and gave me an address that wasn't too far from my route. During the journey, Carla spoke little. Every time he tried to start a conversation, his answers were short and evasive, as if he didn't want to give too much away. However, there was something about his presence that was eerily familiar. Finally, we arrive at a small hamlet on the side of the road. He pointed me to an old wooden house with lights flickering faintly on the porch. "Here it is," he said, and before he got out of the truck, he looked me straight in the eye. "Thank you, Miguel. I won't forget this." I saw her enter the house and waited a few minutes before starting again. Something in his gaze, in the way he thanked me, left me with a sense of uneasiness that I couldn't shake. A couple of weeks later, I found myself back down that route. I decided to stop by the farmhouse to check on Carla, an irrational impulse that I couldn't contain. Upon arrival, I noticed that the house was in the same state of abandonment, but something had changed. An old man stepped out onto the porch, looking at me suspiciously. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice hoarse and stern. "I'm looking for Carla," I said. "I left it here a few weeks ago." The old man's face hardened. Several neighbors began to come out of their houses, looking at me with eyes full of suspicion and something else, perhaps fear. "Carla is not here," said the old man, his voice heavy with palpable sadness. "But I left it here. She asked me to take her home." The old man shook his head, and I saw a shadow of pain cross his face. "Carla died 5 years ago in an accident on Route 66, right in the same place where you say you picked it up." A shiver ran down my spine. The murmurs of the neighbors intensified, and some made the sign of the cross. I couldn't believe my ears. "There must be a mistake," I tried to argue, but the stern looks of the neighbors told me I wasn't welcome there. I returned to my truck with my heart pounding. As I started and walked away from the farmhouse, the image of Carla and her sad look kept haunting my mind. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? But his presence had been so real. His voice, his touch. I didn't sleep that night. Carla's memories and the old man's revelation haunted me. I decided to do more research, and over time, I discovered old articles that talked about her accident, describing a woman in a white dress who had been seen calling for help on Route 66 just before she died. As I delved deeper into the story, more chilling details emerged. Carla had been a young mother who tragically died when her car skidded on a dangerous curve and crashed into a tree. According to accounts, his spirit had been seen several times by night drivers, always in the same place, always looking for one last ride home. I began to question my sanity. Could it be that he had really picked up a ghost? Every time I thought about it, the cold invaded my body, as if its presence still surrounded me. I decided to go back one last time to the place where I picked her up, driven by a mixture of fear and need for answers. The night was dark and quiet when I arrived at the scene of the accident. The rain had stopped, leaving a thick, cold air. I turned off the engine and got out of the truck, looking around. The silence was almost deafening. I approached the tree where the accident had supposedly occurred. There were withered flowers and extinguished candles, remnants of ancient tributes. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I turned sharply, and there she was, Carla, in her white dress, soaking wet in an invisible rain. "Miguel," his voice was a whisper, barely audible. "Thank you for taking me home." My heart raced, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear and disbelief. Carla held out a hand to me, and I felt an icy chill run through my body. "I can't rest," he said, his green eyes shining with infinite sadness. "I can't find peace." What do you need?" I managed to ask in a trembling voice. "My daughter," she said, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "I have to make sure he's okay." With those words, his figure began to fade, leaving behind a sense of emptiness and despair. I went back to the truck, my mind in a storm of thought. I decided to look for Carla's daughter, convinced that it was the only way to give her the peace she needed. After digging through old archives and talking to some of the villagers, I discovered that Carla's daughter, a girl named Sophia, lived with her grandparents, the same ones who had looked at me with suspicion that time. I approached them cautiously, explaining my encounter with Carla and my desire to help. To my surprise, the grandparents, though skeptical at first, accepted my help. Sophia had grown up hearing stories from her mother and had always felt an inexplicable connection to the crash site. Together, we went to the spot where Carla had passed away, bringing fresh flowers and lighting candles. Sophie, with tears in her eyes, spoke into the darkness, assuring her mother that she was well, that she was happy, and that she would always carry her in his heart. At that moment, I felt a warm breeze, like a sigh of relief, and I knew that Carla had finally found peace. Since then, every time I passed that road, I look to the side of the road in the hope that I will never see that lonely figure again. Carla's story taught me that some encounters on the road are more than coincidences. They are opportunities to help lost souls find their way home. Story 2. Jose Vulcano. They ask for help. The Sierras of Cordoba, Argentina. It was a closed, moonless night, and the wind howled as I drove my old Scania down one of those endless, lonely desert roads. The roar of the engine was my only company, but something in the air made me feel uneasy, as if I were being watched. He'd heard stories about this route, accounts from drivers who had seen things they couldn't explain, but he'd always dismissed them as mere legends. He had spent hours without finding a soul, only the black asphalt and the vastness of the desert on either side. I decided to turn on the radio to break the silence, but I only got static. The coffee in my thermos was cold, and my eyelids were getting heavier and heavier. That's when I saw them. In the distance, dimly lit by the truck's headlights, were figures walking through the field. I thought my mind was playing tricks on me due to tiredness, but the figures were still there, moving erratically through the bushes and dunes. I slowed down, trying to see better. As I got closer, the figures seemed to change direction and move toward the road, as if they wanted to intercept me. My heart started beating faster. The truck's headlights finally illuminated the figures clearly. They were people, at least it seemed that way at first. Men, women, and children, all with expressions of despair and terror, ran toward me, waving their arms frantically for help. I slammed on the brakes, the screech of the brakes echoing through the night. I rolled down the window, and one of them, a man with torn clothes and sunken eyes, got to the truck first. "Help us!" he cried, his voice cracking and desperate. "Please!" Before he could react, more people reached the truck, banging on the windows, begging for help. Their faces were marked with suffering, and their eyes reflected indescribable fear. Something didn't add up. There was something strange about their movements, about the way their bodies seemed to flicker and distort under the light. My gut was telling me something was terribly wrong. I closed the windows and stepped on the gas, leaving behind the figures running alongside the truck, their screams fading into the distance. The truck roared as I drove away, but fear had settled in my chest like an anchor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something supernatural had happened. I decided not to stop until I reached the next town, where I could find a safe place and some human companionship to remind me of what normalcy is. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I arrived in a dusty little town. I parked the truck in front of an old gas station and went into the adjacent bar. The few customers there looked at me curiously as I approached the bar. I ordered a coffee and tried to calm my nerves. The waiter, an older man with an unfriendly face, came over and poured me the drink. "Where do you come from?" he asked in a raspy voice. "From the road," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I saw something. I miss it out there. People begging for help in the middle of the desert." The man stared at me for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You've seen the spirits," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. My hands trembled as I heard his words. "Spirits?" The waiter leaned over the bar, lowering his voice. "Years ago, there was a terrible accident on that road. A bus full of people veered off the road and crashed into the desert. They all died, and they say their souls never found rest. They show up from time to time, looking for help, trying to find their way home." I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat. "They can't be real. I saw them. They seemed so real." "That's what makes them most frightening," the man said. "Their spirits are trapped, reliving the moment of their death, desperate to escape. You can't help them. No one can." I finished my coffee quickly, feeling fear suffocating me. I thanked the bartender and walked out of the bar, heading back to the truck. I had no intention of going back to that road, but my route required me to go through it again. That night at the village motel, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of those people, their hands desperately banging on the windows of the truck. I decided that I needed to face what I had seen to understand it better. The next morning, I was back on the road. I drove slowly, watching for any signs from the figures. The dawn sun bathed the desert in an orange glow, and for a while everything seemed normal. But then I saw them again, in the same place. The figures walked erratically, but this time they weren't running towards the truck. They seemed simply existing, trapped in their own nightmare. I stopped the truck and got out, my heart pounding in my ears. I approached the figures slowly, and one of them, a woman with a pale face and empty eyes, turned to me. "Help us," he whispered, his voice like the wind through the leaves. "We are lost." I felt a mixture of compassion and terror. I couldn't do anything for them, but I also couldn't ignore their suffering. I decided that the only thing I could do was acknowledge their presence, give them a moment of peace. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't help you, but I know you're here. You're not alone." The figures began to slowly fade, their forms dissipating into the morning air. I don't know if my words offered them any comfort, but in that moment, I felt like I had done the right thing. I got back in the truck and continued my journey, although the figures no longer appeared. Their memories stayed with me. Every time I pass that road, I look at the desert with a new respect, aware that some travelers never find their destination. From that night, I became something of a guardian of that route, telling my story to other drivers, warning them about spirits walking around for help. Some believe me, others laugh, but everyone understands that the road holds its own secrets, and that they are certainly not pleasant at all. Story 3, Dario Cespedes. The Others at the Station, California, USA. Each route has its own secrets, and after 15 years of being a truck driver, I thought I knew them all. However, one night I realized that there were still things on the road that could make my blood run cold. I was in the middle of a long drive from San Antonio to Albuquerque, a journey I had made hundreds of times. That night, however, the station's radio screeched with a different assignment. "Dario, we have a change of route for you," said the metallic voice of Charlie, the night operator. "We need you to stop at the Echo Ridge gas station to fill up the tank. They have had problems with the supply at the usual stops." Echo Ridge. He couldn't remember hearing that name before. But in this business, orders are orders. I checked the GPS and found the location. I was on a detour about 20 miles from my usual route, but not too far. The night was particularly dark, moonless, and with a thick fog that made visibility difficult. I drove cautiously, following the signs until I finally saw the rickety sign advertising the Echo Ridge gas station. Upon arrival, I noticed that the place looked old, as if it had been built in the 50s and had not been touched since. However, what surprised me the most was that despite the dilapidated appearance, there were people. Several cars were parked and a couple more truckers were filling up their tanks. I felt a slight relief to see that I was not alone in this strange place. I stopped my truck next to one of the fuel pumps and started filling it up. The hose emitted a rhythmic, almost hypnotic noise. As I waited, I observed the people around me. There was something rare in them. They looked normal to the naked eye, but there were details that didn't add up. Their clothes were old-fashioned, their movements slow and mechanical, and their stares vacant, as if they weren't really there. I finished filling up the tank and decided to go down to the attached convenience store to buy some food. Upon entering, the atmosphere became even stranger. The lighting was dim, and the shelves were filled with products that looked like they came out of another era. Packets of cookies and soda cans with designs I hadn't seen in decades. I approached the counter where an older man with a blank expression was staring at me. "Good night," I said, trying to sound casual. "Do you have sandwiches?" The man didn't immediately respond. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I felt a shiver run down my spine. "In the background, by the soda," he finally said, his voice monotonous and devoid of emotion. I walked to the refrigerator, feeling the gazes of the other customers fixed on me. I grabbed a couple of plastic-wrapped sandwiches and a soda. Returning to the counter, I noticed that the woman next to me had her hands covered in dark stains, as if stained with old oil or worse. I avoided his gaze and paid for my things, anxious to get out of there. By the time I emerged, the fog had thickened even more, shrouding the station in an oppressive blanket. I walked quickly to my truck, feeling a growing urge to leave. But just before I went up, I heard a voice behind me. "Hey, dude." I turned and saw another truck driver, one I hadn't noticed before. He was tall and thin, with a sparse beard and sunken eyes. "Yes," I replied, trying to remain calm. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low but full of intensity. "This place is not for us." "What do you mean?" I asked, though deep down I already knew the answer. "Just go before it's too late," he said, and walked away, disappearing into the fog. I climbed into the truck and started the engine, my heart pounding. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the people at the gas station watching me. Their faces were gloomy, and their figures slowly faded into the mist. I drove without stopping until I was miles away. Only then did I dare to breathe easier. The road cleared and the fog was left behind, but the memory of Echo Ridge didn't fade so easily. The next day, when I arrived at my destination, I told Charlie about my experience. "Echo Ridge, you say?" he replied, an eyebrow raised. "That station has been closed since the 1970s. There was a fire. A lot of people died. It must be a system error." I fell silent, feeling an inexplicable cold inside me. I didn't know what else to say. Since that night, I avoid routes I don't know well and gas stations that seem out of place. Because on the road, there are secrets best left undiscovered and echoes of the past that can trap you if you're not careful. That was the last time I heard about Echo Ridge, but in my nightmares, I often see those figures again, motionless in the fog, staring at me with empty eyes, waiting. If you like these stories, please I invite you to like, subscribe, and press the bell button so that more stories like these reach your ears. Have a good night.